Good evening. I'm Daniel Mendelsohn. It's my pleasure to introduce Sebastian Barry this evening, which I will do by means of a little anecdote. I have a friend in New York, the very eminent editor called Robert Gottlieb, who is my reading advisor. And whenever he tells me that I ought to read a book, I always do, and I never regret it. 2 years ago, I got a phone call from Bob, who has been the editor of Alfred A. Knopf, the publishing house, Simon & Schuster, the New Yorker magazine. So I'm saying that just to let you know that he is not easily impressed. And he called me and he said, I have just read the great American novel. It just happens not to be by an American. The novel that Bob was talking about was the wonderful novel by Sebastian Barry called Days Without End, which is a novel that actually would have particular resonance for us this evening, given where we are. It's about two young men whose lives in the middle of the 19th century intersect with some of the most traumatic events in the history of this continent. They're first sort of absorbed into the efforts by the United States Army to exterminate the native peoples. Then they sort of blunder into the Civil War. And so the story of these two extremely charming and wonderful characters becomes entwined with some of the ugliest moments in American history. One of them is an Irish immigrant called Thomas McNulty. And the story of these two young men is, despite the grimness of the subject, manages to have a sort of radiant beauty, which is surprising. So I read this book, and I agreed with Bob that it's one of the most beautiful novels that either one of us had read in 20 years, probably. And then I thought, I have to know more. And in fact, one can know more, because Thomas McNulty, as it turns out, is the member of a family whose lives are traced in other novels of Sebastian Barry. Sebastian Barry was born in 1955, grew up in Dublin. His father was an architect, and as I recently learned, also a poet. His mother was a very distinguished Irish actress, Joan O'Hara. And he came to prominence in his late 20s, in the early 1980s, with a couple of volumes of poems which he published, established himself as a major figure in the literary world, originally as a playwright from the mid-1980s until quite recently, as recently as 2010, with a number of important plays, but is probably best known to American audiences through his marvelous novels, and a series of novels in particular that began with the publication of a novel called The Whereabouts of Ennius McNulty, published in 1998. You'll recognize the name. Ennius McNulty turns out to be related to the Thomas McNulty whom I was just telling you about in the more recent novel, Days Without End. And there are 3 novels about the McNultys. There are 3 novels about another family called the Dunns. The McNulty family is loosely based on the maternal family of the author, and the Dunns are loosely based on the family of his father. These are extraordinary works that are both about Ireland and, more importantly, about life in the most important and beautiful ways. And I very much look forward to discussing them in greater depth with Sebastian Barry, whom I must say I was so excited to meet. And we had dinner last night. We met in our hotel and went out to dinner at the Café Pasquale. And although I had 2 margaritas, I remember it in great detail. And I then got home and spent the next hour texting all my friends saying that I had met the wonderful Sebastian Barry, who I can assure you is as wonderful in real life as he is on the page. So please help me welcome Sebastian Barry. Thank you.
Hello. Obviously full of Irish people. Although I don't see any Irish names in Santa Fe, which is very curious. Usually in America, it's just Irish names, with a few English ones squeezed in somewhere. Lannan, indeed, and I do want to genuinely and heartfeltly thank the Lannan Foundation for bringing me to the very end of the Santa Fe Trail. I thought you might be a little more raucous than I find you. But you've obviously changed your ways a little bit. This is why I'm leaving in 2 days, because I want to read. I'll read from 3 of the books, and maybe if we've time, a tiny little speech at the end of this play, The Steward of Christendom. I was like some opera singers. I didn't feel I had a voice till I was 40 when this play was produced, and it seemed to be a seed for anything else I've done in the last 20 years. This book, A Long, Long Way, arises almost straight out of this, because Willie Dunn, the protagonist of A Long, Long Way, is in this play just as a child of light. He comes to his father's awful room in the county home and sings him the Ave Maria. It's a very complicated issue about Irish soldiers in the First World War. The word British comes into it. The word British has many, many meanings as it hits each plate of Irish history. It changes. But my actual great-uncle and my great-grandfather, his father was the DMP, Chief Superintendent of the DMP, that's to say, of the Dublin Police Force before independence. So Willie Dunn is already in a difficult position. He hasn't grown to 6 feet, which would allow him enter the police force. So to please his father, he joins the army instead, because he's only 5'6". So these men, bear in mind 200,000 Irish men, not even thinking about the women for a moment, volunteered for the First World War. There was never subscription in Ireland. About 50,000 of those men never came home. The difficulty was that right in the middle of the war, there was the uprising, the rising of 1916. So by the time the soldiers came home, they were if they came home, in a very invidious position. And this is partly or wholly what this book is about. I had no idea what the book was about before I wrote it. I was very worried about doing it, because if you spend a year reading about the First World War, actually the thing you want to do is never think about it again. But the mercy of the book was that as soon as I had the platoon, as soon as Willie was there with his sergeant, Christy Moran, and the other lads, I felt happy to be with them. And one of the marks of the First World War is that men, if they survived, oftentimes looked back on it, strangely enough, as almost the best time in their lives. Because it was a time when friendships between men were forged with a metal that is not available to you in ordinary life. This little part of the book describes something that is happening for the first time in the war, and you will know what it is before the men know in the story. And this is what happens. It's early in, I think, 1915, that sort of time, early enough in the war. And brace yourselves, because I am going to sing, but it'll be very brief, painful and brief. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, and the sweetest girl I know. Then a different day arrived. Everyone had had a lash of tea, and there was a lot of farting going on after the big yellow beans that had come up around 12. As usual, after they had eaten, they were beginning to look at each other and think this St. Julian wasn't the worst place they'd been in. It was the essential illusion bestowed on them by full stomachs. A breeze had pushed through the tall grasses all day. There was a yellow flower everywhere with 100 tiny blooms on it. The caterpillars loved them. There were millions of caterpillars, the same yellow as the flowers. It was a yellow world. Captain Pasley was in his new dugout writing his forms. Every last thing that came in and every last thing that went out was accounted for, items and bodies. Captain Pasley, of course, was obliged to read all the letters the men sent home, and he did. Word for blessed word. He thought it might break a man's heart to read them sometimes. There was something awfully sad about some of the soldiers' letters. They didn't mean to make them sad, which gave their efforts to be manly and cheerful, a melancholy tinge, but it had to be faced. God help them, they were funny enough efforts sometimes. Some men wrote a letter as formal as a bishop. Some tried to write the insides of their heads like that young Willie Dunn. It was a curiosity. The yellow smoke was noticed first by Christy Moran because he was standing on the fire step with his less than handy mirror arrangement looking out across the quiet battlefield. That little breeze had freshened, and it blew now against the ratty hair that dropped out of Christy Moran's hat here and there. So the breeze was more of a wind and was blowing full on against Christy's hat and mirror, but it was nothing remarkable. What was remarkable was the strange yellow-tinged cloud that had just appeared from nowhere like a sea fog. But not like a fog, really. He knew what a flaming fog looked like, for God's sake, being born and bred near the sea in fucking Kingstown. He watched for a few seconds in his mirror, straining to see and straining to understand. It was about 4 o'clock. And all as peaceful as anything. Not even the guns were firing now. The caterpillars foamed on the yellow flowers. And the grass died in the path of the cloud. That was only Christy Moran's impression, maybe. He hiked down the mirror a moment and wiped it clean with his cleanish sleeve. Back up it went. The cloud didn't look too deep, but it was as wide as the eye could see. Christy Moran was absolutely certain now he could see figures moving in the yellow smoke. It must be some sort of way of hiding the advancing men, he was thinking. Some new-fashioned piece of warfare. Would you ever fetch out the captain? He said to O'Hara. All right, boys, stand now in readiness. Get those rifles up here. Machine gunners, start firing there into that bloody cloud. So the gun detail leaped to their machine gun, Joe McNulty and Joe Keelty, the loaders as ever, Mayo men and cousins too, that joined up somewhere against the wishes of their fathers they had confessed, and the bullets started clattering away from them, the waterman keeping the gun well cooled, the shooter firm on his knees and expecting all the while to have the top of his noggin shot off. But this was a very curious advance. Captain Pasley came out and stood contemplatively by Christy Moran, who had abandoned his mirror and was standing up on the fire step. Such was his puzzlement. What's going on, Sergeant Major? Said Captain Pasley. I couldn't tell you for the life of me, said Christy Moran. There's just this big fucking cloud about 50 yards off drifting along in the wind. It doesn't look like fog. It might be smoke from fires the Boche are burning. Might be. You can see them coming on. I thought I could, sir, but there doesn't seem to be anyone. No shouts, no cries. It's as quiet as a nursery, sir, and all the babies asleep. Very good, Sergeant Major. Cease firing, men. The Algerians to the right were a little ahead of them as the trench twisted away there in a slight salient. All the Irish were on the fire step now, all along the length of the trench, some 1,500 men showing their faces to this unknown freak of weather or whatever it might be. The commanding officer was rung up and told what was afoot, but sure, there wasn't any coherent order he could think to give except to be cautious and shoot anything that came creeping. There had been no warning barrage and the dense smoke didn't look too threatening. It was beautiful in a way. The yellow seemed to boil about and sink into whatever craters it was offered and then rise again with the march of the main body of smoke. There were still birds singing behind them, but whatever birds had been singing in front of them were silent now. Captain Pasley removed his hat and scratched his balding pate and put the hat back on again. "I don't know," he said. "Like a London fog, only worse." The big snake of turning yellow reached the parapet of the Algerian stretch of the trench far over to the right, and now strange noises were heard. The soldiers seemed to be milling about haphazardly, as if invisible soldiers had fallen in on them and were bayoneting without restraint. That wasn't a good sound. The colonial men were roaring now, and there were other frightening cries, as if the unseen horde were throttling them. Of course, the Irishmen could not see into the trenches as such, but in their mind's eye, ferocious slaughter was afoot. Those men from country districts must have thought of pukas and fairy hordes, because only such tales of childhood and fireside seemed to match these evil miracles. Horrible laments rose from the affronted Algerians. Now they were climbing up the parados and seemed to be fleeing back toward the rear. The smoke came steadily on. "It's the smoke," said Captain Pasley. "There's something wrong with the smoke, gents." Now, in his old house at home in Wicklow, there were 7 fireplaces, and 2 or 3 of them were as leaky as old buckets. And when they were lit, smoke poured forth into the bedrooms above them, and that was an evil smoke. But it would not drive you back as if you were cattle, as was happening to those poor men of Algiers, now for some reason tearing off their uniforms and writhing on the ground and howling. Howling was the word for it. The Dublin Fusiliers took the smoke at the furthest right tip beside the Algerians. Exactly the same thing happened. Now the men were possessed of an utter fear of this dark and seemingly infernal thing creeping along, seeming to make the grass fizz and silencing birds and turning men into howling demons. On instinct, the men pushed down along the trench, as anyone would do in the same circumstance, crowding into the next stretch suddenly, so that the men there for a moment thought they were being attacked from the turn of the trench. These men in turn were panicked and poured on into the next section, and because the line at the trench was at only the slightest of angles to the line of the smoke, they had to move proportionately faster to keep ahead of it. Soon the 3rd and 4th stretches were in a hopeless tangle, and the smoke poured in upon them. In the sudden yellowy darkness, awful sounds sprang up like a harvest of hopeless cries. O'Hara started to scramble up the parados behind, and it was only Christy Moran's bark that made him stop. The sergeant major looked at the captain. Captain Pasley's face had turned the colour of a sliced potato. There was the same bloom on it also of damp. "I need to ring headquarters and ask them what to do. What is this hellish thing?" "No time for that, sir," said the sergeant major. "Can I let the men fall back, sir?" "I have no earthly orders for such a thing," said Captain Pasley. "We are to hold this position. That's all there is to it." "You won't hold nothing against that smoke, sir. Best to fall back to the reserve trenches anyhow. There's something deathly and wrong." But before such a sensible conversation could continue, the smoke was slipping down the parapet about a dozen yards ahead, itself like dozens and dozens of slithering fingers, and there was a stench so foul that Willie Dunn gripped his stomach. Joe McNulty came tumbling down from his emplacement, gripping his Mayo throat like a dog done in by poison meant for rats. "Get the fuck out," said Christy Moran. "All right," said the captain. "I'll hold the fort here, Sergeant Major." "You will and your fuck, sir, begging your flaming pardon. Come on." Willie Dunn and his comrades scaled the parados, and everyone started to stumble back across the broken ground. It was astonishing to be up, out of the trench, and going along at the level of normal things. Ghosts of soldiers plummeted out of the smoke up to the right and tottered screaming along, falling to their knees, their hands around their throats like those funny men in the music halls that would pretend to be being strangled. It was their own hands at their necks doing the throttling. Now there was no question of order or retreat. The soldiers that had not had a dance with the smoke just went tearing away towards what they hoped was safety. After some hundreds of yards, they reached one of the advanced batteries, who without a word caught the horror in their faces and began to shout and pull and jostle to try to get up the horses quickly to bring off the guns, for it would be a fearsome disaster to let guns be captured. But it was all aspiration when the scores and scores of suffering men were beheld, staggering towards them like an insane enemy. The artillerymen scarpered too. There was nothing else to be done. Anyone that lingered tasted the smoke, felt the sharp tines in his throat, raking and gashing, and he was undone. Now and then, miraculously, a man seemed to run unscathed from the gloom, running all the faster for his escape. Rifles were scattered now across the pounded fields, as if some proper battle were being fought after all. Willie Dunn ran with the rest. There was a bottleneck ahead where the ground had been fought over a few weeks back, and the men had to get up on a rough road to make any progress at all. This, of course, engendered the wild fear of being prevented from escaping it all, and still the vile smoke came on behind. Men were slushing into craters to try to swim across and could not get up the other blessed side. No act of virtue or rescue was possible. Every man had to do for himself. Thank you. I had already started this book, The Secret Scripture, when my editor at Faber, in a very mysterious way, launching the book before any of these, Annie Dunn, sitting in a bar, a man called John Riley, a very magical editor in London at Faber and Faber. And he said, "It's been many years, Seb, since there was a book about the Irish soldiers of the First World War. You know, he said, looking away, I think I'd pay rather a lot of money for that book." So, and then I was worried that he didn't like the book I was actually writing at the time. But nevertheless, being an impoverished writer, I went back to do The Secret Scripture. And it used to be called Hammers and Feathers, which was a phrase of Roseanne's mother, that life was, or mother-in-law actually, that life was a collection of hammers and feathers. And I was worried that no one would understand the title, so I wrote a little bit of the book to explain the title. Imagine my confusion then when I called it The Secret Scripture. But it's still here in the book. It's just a little moment. Roseanne is 100 years old, more or less, and she's writing in one of the asylums in Roscommon the story of her life, and she's putting this story under the floorboards so no one will ever read it. Because she doesn't want anyone to read it, she's not writing it for anyone except herself, because she wants to meet herself midway through her book, coming the other direction, like Dante in the wood. She is a Presbyterian woman who has great beauty. Now, I did have such a great aunt, and my great aunt was sectioned in the 40s into an asylum. I should think, really, her crime was beauty. I haven't time to tell you the misery of some of the things we have done in Ireland to ourselves post-independence. But one of them was putting women in asylums when they were considered extra to the requirements of the inheritance of farms, or who weren't going to be married, or who didn't want to emigrate. And a lot of women found themselves being sectioned. Or if they were with child, they could then be called nymphomaniacs, and the parish priest would bring them along and tuck them into these dreadful places. And in my family, this woman, we were told, or they were told, and I must not feel totally non-complicit in this, that this person had died of TB. So they killed her twice. They erased her twice. But my belief is that she lived to a very great age in the asylum. And she wants to tell you, we're not sure. There's a priest in this book called Father Gaunt, for whom I have a few good words, and also so does she. But any of the readers of the book have no good words for Father Gaunt. I have tried to say, no. And he does engineer her horror, really. Before all that happens, though, in his account of her, he says that she often lies and that her account of things is untrue. And this may be so. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Green, concludes eventually that even if she's not telling the truth, he prefers her untruth because it radiates health. And that's what he's interested in. He's having to assess this woman. In this account of her life, which he eventually does read, she has a great love of her father, which is quite evident. Whether she is accurate in how she remembers him or what he did later in his time in Sligo is debatable. But she's telling the story, and who are we to argue with her now? And all she's going to tell you is this little passage that her foolish descendant made up to explain the title of the book that is not the title of the book. So we all have our madnesses. When I was 10 or so, sorry, I have to sing, oh God, okay. This is her song. You will know this song, I hope. I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls with vassals and serfs at my side, of all who assembled within those walls, that I was the hope and the pride. When I was 10 or so, my father, in a fit of educating enthusiasm, brought me to the top of the long, thin tower in the graveyard. It was one of those beautiful, lofty, slim buildings made by monks in a time of danger and destruction. It stood in a nettled corner of the graveyard and was not much remarked on. When you had grown up in Sligo, it was just there. But no doubt it was a treasure beyond compare, put up with only a murmur of mortar between the stones, each one remembering the curve of the tower, each one set in with perfect success by ancient masons. Of course it was a Catholic yard. My father had not got that job because of his religion, but because he was deeply liked in the town by all and sundry, and the Catholics did not mind their graves being dug by a Presbyterian if it was a likeable one. Because in those days, there was often much greater ease between the churches than we give credit for, and it is often forgotten that under the old penal laws, in vanished days, the dissenting churches were just as harried as they often like to point out. At any rate, there is seldom a difficulty with religion where there is friendship. And it was only later that this distinction in him made any difference. At any rate, I know he was exceedingly liked by the parish priest, a little perky, darting man called Father Gaunt, who loomed so large later in my own story, if a small man can be said to loom large. Those were the days just after the First War, and maybe in those ditches of history, as it were, minds turned to strangenesses, quirks of education, such as he was bent on that day with me. Otherwise, I cannot explain why a grown man would take his child to the top of an old tower with a bag of hammers and feathers. All of Sligo, river, churches, houses, radiated out from the foot of the tower, or so it seemed from the little window at the top. A passing bird might have seen two excited faces trying to peer out at the same time, myself heaping my weight onto my toes and bumping the underside of his chin. "Roseanne, dearest, I shaved already this morning, and you won't shave me anyhow with the top of your golden head." For it was true, I had soft hair like gold, like the gold of those selfsame monks, yellow as the gleams in old books. "Papa," I said, "for the love of all things, drop the hammers and feathers and let's see what's what." "Oh," he said, "I am weary from the climb. Let's just scope our eyes over Sligo before we attempt our experiment." He had waited and chosen a windless day for his work. He wished to prove to me the ancient premise that all things fall at the same rate in the realm of theory. "All things fall at the same rate," he had said, "in the realm of theory, and I will prove it to you. I will prove it to myself." We had been sitting by the spitting anthracite of our fire. "All may fall at the same rate, as you say," my mother piped up from her corner, "but it's the rare thing rises." I do not think this was a cut at him, but just an observation. At any rate, he looked over at her with the perfect neutrality she herself was mistress of and had taught him. It is strange to me writing this here in this darkened room, scratching it all out in blue biro ink, somehow to see them in my mind's eye or somewhere behind my eyes, in the darkened bowl of my head, still there, alive and talking truly, as if their time was real time and mine was an illusion. It touches my heart for the 1000th time how beautiful she is, how neat, agreeable, and shining, with her Southampton accent like the pebbles on the beach there disturbed by the waves, rushing, shushing, a soft sound that sounds in my dreams. It is also true that when I was bold,
When she worried that my path was veering from the path she wanted for me, even in small matters, she was wont to whip me. But in those times, children were routinely hit. So now our two faces were jostling for position, framed by the ancient frame of the monk's little look-see window. What vanished faces had peered out there, sweating in their robes, trying to see where the Vikings were that would come to kill them and take their books, their vessels, and their coins. No mason likes to leave a large window for Vikings, and that window spoke still of old nervousness and peril. At length it was clear that his experiment was impossible with both of us there. One or other of us would miss the outcome. So he sent me back down on my own by the dank stairway of stones, and I can still feel that wet wall under my hand and the strange fright that grew in me to be separated from him, my little breast beating as if there was an uncomfortable pigeon trap there. I came out from the tower and stood away from the base as he had bid me, for fear of the hammers falling and killing me dead. The tower looked enormous from there. It seemed to stretch up to the filthy grey clouds of that day, to heaven. Not a breeze stirred. The neglected graves of that section of the yard, the graves of men and women of some century where the people could only afford rough stones and not a name writ upon them, seemed different now on my own, as if their poor skeletons might rise up against me to devour me in their eternal hunger. Standing on the ground, I was a child on a precipice. That was the feeling, like that scene in the old play, King Lear, where the king's friend imagines he is falling down a beetling cliff, where there is no cliff, so that when you read it, you also think there is a cliff, and fall with the king's friend. But I peered up, faithfully, lovingly. It is no crime to love your father. It is no crime to feel no criticism of him, especially so when I knew him into my early womanhood, or nearly when a child tends to grow disappointed in her parents. It is no crime to feel your heart beating up to him, or as much of him as I could see, his arm now stuck out the little window and the bag held suspended in the Irish air. Now he was calling to me, and I could barely catch his words, but after a few repeats, I think I heard him say, "Are you stood back, dearest?" "I am stood back, Papa," I called. I nearly screamed. Such a distance the words had to rise, and such a small window to enter to reach his ears. "Then I will let loose the bag. Watch, watch," he called. "Yes, Papa, I am watching." He loosened the top of the bag as best he could with the fingers of one hand and shook the contents free. I had seen him place them there. It was a handful of feathers from the feather bolster on their bed, plucked out against the screeches of his wife, and 2 mason's hammers he kept for when he repaired the little walls and headstones of graves. I stared and stared. Maybe I heard a curious music, the chattering of the jackdaws and the old scratchy talking of the rooks in the great beech trees there mingled like a music in my head. My neck was straining, and I was bursting to see the outcome of that elegant experiment, an outcome my father had said might stand to me in my life as the basis of a proper philosophy. Although there was not a breath of wind, the feathers immediately drifted away, dispersing like a little explosion, even rising greyly against the grey clouds, almost impossible to see. The feathers drifted away. My father was calling in enormous excitement in the tower. "What do you see? What do you see?" What did I see? What did I know? It is sometimes, I think, the strain of ridiculousness in a person, a ridiculousness born maybe of desperation, such as also Ennius MacNutt, you do not know who that is yet, exhibited so many years later, that pierces you through with love for that person. It is all love, that not knowing, that not seeing. I am standing there eternally, straining to see, a crick in the back of my neck, peering and straining, if for no other reason than for love of him. The feathers are drifting away, drifting, swirling away. My father is calling and calling. My heart is beating back to him. The hammers are falling still. Days without end. For my son, Toby, although I am related to him, I regard as one of the most radiant, most lovely,
most precious, most extraordinary people I have seen in my 63 years. When he was 15, I should say, someday he might be 50, which is an extraordinary thought. Someday I might be 50, but I'd be going the other way. When he was 15, he became very unhappy for a year. And this is rather remarkable because he was actually a child born smiling, one of those children. He smiled shortly after he was born, which you're not supposed to be able to do, but he did. And he kept smiling. And then when he was 15 or so, he was no longer smiling, and it was very frightening. And when you're a parent of a child who's exhibiting a moderate depression or so, you become extremely concerned. Our district of Ireland, unfortunately, has huge problems with young men being depressed, which often have horrible endings. And we were terrified, my wife and I did everything. I thought, well, maybe it's his piano. He doesn't want to do piano anymore. Is that because his teacher was quite severe? And I thought, but he was a brilliant piano player. I thought, maybe. So I said, do you want to give up piano? Oh, well, yes, actually, I would, he said. But it wasn't that. It was something else, because the depression continued. And then one day, actually, I think it was daytime, but my wife and I were in bed, obviously exhausted by this child-rearing experience. And Toby, on the instruction of the true philosopher in our house, which is his sister, Carol, who glories in the title of boxing and mixed martial arts and boxing correspondent from Metro Online in London, so quite a considerable person herself, told him, Toby, please, just go in and say it. So Toby comes up to our bed. By the way, he disputes every item of this account that I'm now giving you, but I don't really know what happened. This is how I remember it, like Roseanne. And he said, the thing is, Dad, I'm gay. And something, if you can imagine, in those old films where the heavenly choir suddenly plays, it was very like that. And a sort of feeling of release, not only and freedom, true Irish freedom, you could say, for us, but also for him. And in the days ahead, in the weeks and months ahead, he took it upon himself to be my professor of gayness. And, we did our 17 episodes of RuPaul's Drag Race, which I was fascinated by. And eventually, what Toby is, not just his gayness, but his absolute radiance as a human being, crept into the book I was just beginning to write. And a lot of his gift to me as a son is in this character of Thomas. In the little bit I want to read, with my eye on that mysterious clock that none of you could see, it's terrifying. It's like the alarm clock in the hotel when you haven't slept all night from jet lag, and it's, oh my God, I have to get up in a minute. He is doing something that would often have been part of this part of the world, and districts all radiating out from here, which is buffalo hunting. And when he's in the army, Thomas, by this time, and rather grievously, and this is part of the purpose of the book, is engaged in the so-called Indian Wars. So he's an Irishman who has endured, his 7 centuries of colonization and has then gone to America in great distress and taken a job that basically is bringing such grief to people not unlike himself. Anyway, in the army, when you were well west of the Mississippi or the Missouri, as you are here, there were no shops, and if you didn't hunt for your food, you were going to starve. So this is a little moment where he is, and it's very inspired by a very great book by Francis Parkman called The Oregon Trail, which is somewhat north of here, which made, when I read that book, I felt I could possibly have a go at this myself. So he's telling the story, and he probably was Irish-speaking when he got to America, so he has learned his own version of America, so we'll go with that. Little birdie, oh little birdie, why do you fly so high? It's because I am a pretty little bird, and I do not wish to die.
So what happens next day was me and John Cole and Watchorn himself and also a nice son of a bitch called Pearl. We went up with the scouts to find that herd. We came into marshy ground first, but the Shawnee boys knew the path through and we weaved along it content enough. Cook had put some of his cooked sparrows in our stomachs. We were after something bigger. Shawnees, seem to remember one of them was called Birdsong, as it happens. Cool-minded, timber-skin boys they were, giving themselves the old information in their own lingo. Had done up their prayer bags the night before, kind of lucky charms they liked to put together in an old bag made from the scrotum of a buffalo. They were lashed to their ponies' necks now. They rode without saddles. Long before we had news of it, they were going slower. They knew something was close. They brought us about a mile sideways so we could start to work in up the wind. There was a big, low, sickle-shaped hill before us, covered in a dark grass, and the country there was quiet and almost windless, except for a sound you were guessing might be the sound of the sea. There was no sea thereabouts, we knew. Then we breasted the hill. It was giving a horizon of maybe 4 miles, and I drew in my breath, amazed, because right down below us was a herd of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 buffalo. They must have taken a vow of silence that morning. Shawnees now were putting their ponies into a polite trotting, and ourselves likewise. We were to go down as close to the buffalo as we could without stirring them. Maybe buffalo isn't the smartest chicken in the coop. We had the wind in our faces, such as it was. We knew as soon as they felt us there was going to be fireworks. Sure enough, the nearest dozen must have felt us. They started to stumble all of a sudden, nearly falling down. We must have smelled like death to them. We hoped we did. Birdsong kicked forward and we kicked forward. John Cole was a beautiful rider. He streaked through the Indians and fled after the biggest cow he could spot. I had a line on a big cow too. Must have been that we preferred the cow meat. Then the land dipped again. The near buffalo had set everything moving. It was 10,000 hooves then drumming the hard earth, and the whole cavalcade pouring down into the declivity. Seemed to swallow them, every last one. Then the ground rose in front of us, and there they were again, the flood of buffalo, like a big boil of black molasses in a skillet surging up. Goddamn blackberries, they were as black as. My cow had taken a wild run to the right. She was gearing herself to go through her comrades. I don't know if an angel hadn't given her a message. I was on her tail. You've got to treat a buffalo like a killer, like a rattlesnake on legs. She wants to kill you before you kill her. She wants to lure you on too, and then she wants to suddenly run sideways at you, knock down your horse in full flight, and then come back before Saturday and stamp you to death. You never want to fall to the ground on a buffalo hunt, if I can just instruct you in that. My cow won't act out of character, but I got to get myself in close, get a shot into her head as best I can. It's no easy task to keep your rifle raised and ready when your horse is seeming to be an aficionado of every goddamn rabbit hole out there. He better keep his footing. Maybe we are moving at 30, 40 miles an hour now. Maybe we are sheeting along like the wind. Maybe the herd is making a noise like a great storm coming down from the mountains. But my heart was up, and I couldn't care what happened unless I could get my bullet into her. Blooms in my head the picture of the troopers roasting her and cutting great steaks out of her, the blood running down the meat. Well, I am caterwauling now, and I see the other Shawnee, now nameless in my memory. He is riding down a most splendid bull. He is sitting back on his pony, Indian style, and he is shooting arrows into the bull, who is only a raging, roaring mass of meat and hair. That sight vanishes in a vanishing second. My own task is at hand. Sure enough, she makes a brilliant-minded lunge sideways at me, just as I think I'm steady to strike. But my horse isn't the first time out against buffalo, and he skips to the right like a good dancer. And now we have drawn a bead on that cow, and I fire, and the lovely orange flame shoots the bullet forth, and the burning black steel is absorbed into her shoulder. That girl is all shoulder. We burn along the grasses together. The herd seems to take a violent turn left, as if to escape her approaching fate. I fire again. Then I see her right haunch sort of dip down, just a half a foot. Well, glory be to God. That's the good sign. My heart swells. My pride explodes in my breast. Down, down she goes, a blaze of dust and power, and she takes 15 feet to reach a stop. Must have pierced her heart. That's a dead buffalo. Thank you.
Yes, we got this far. This is a very short speech. So if the Lannan Foundation, in its wisdom, will forgive me, I will read it to you, because this little play was in BAM in 1997 with Donald McCann in the lead, who was our greatest actor, probably one of the greatest actors that ever lived. And as a consequence, it was extremely successful. And Donald was incredibly proud because it meant we, Ali and myself and the kids, could buy a house. We'd literally gone from scraping pennies together for nappies to suddenly having enough money for a house. So my gratitude is infinite to this play and to Donald, and who died in 1999, just a few years after the play. The end of the play, this old man, my great-grandfather, as maybe, is in the county home, and his son comes to him again, but this time they're able to touch each other's hands. So we may assume the destitute old man has passed on. But having passed on, in good Irish style, he tells his son this last story. There was an old woman that lived in the woods. Oh, willa, wall, yeah. There was an old woman that lived in the woods, down by the river Sol, yeah. One time, Willie, and it was Christmas time too, and I was a young fella in Kiltegan, our dog Shep went missing for some days, as dogs in winter will. I was maybe 10 or 11, and I loved that Shep and feared he was gone forever. We had got him as a young dog that had been beaten somewhere and broken till he reached our haven and uncoiled and learned to bark like a baby learns to laugh, and he shone at his work. One morning early after a fall of snow, I went out to break the ice on the rain barrel to plash my face, and I saw his tracks in the snow going up the sloping field, high to the fringes of the wood, and I was greatly afeared because there were drops of blood now and then as he went, little smears of it on the cleanly snow. So I followed him up, sinking here and there in the drifts, well used to it. And on a piece of field we called the upper garden because it was flat there and you could see across to Baltinglass, and some even said to Shillelagh and the dark woods of Coolatin. I found our dog there with the carcass of a ewe well eaten, only the hindquarters remaining. I saw my father's blue sign on the wool and knew the worst, for a dog that would kill a sheep would die himself. So in my innocence, I went down to my father and told him, and he instructed me, as was right and proper, to go back up with the rope and lead Shep down so the killing could take place. The loss of a ewe was a disaster. There'd be pounds of money gone into her. But I loved the dog so sorely. I hesitated when I had the rope tied about him, and at length led him off further up the hill, across the little stand of scrubby pines, and on into the low woods dark with snow and moss. And we went through by a snaking path, I knew, till we got to the other side, where there was a simple man living that made his living from the rabbits and maybe had need of a watchful dog. But he wouldn't take a dog that had killed, though he was a tender man enough, and it behoved me to retrace my steps back into the woods, now moving along but slowly, and the dog sort of dragging behind, as if he knew well his misdeed and his fate. And I stopped in the centre of the trees. And you know my young legs would not go forward. They would not proceed, try as I might. And there I was all that afternoon and night with the dog and the hazels. How is it that the drear of winter didn't eat my bones and murder me for my foolishness? Love of the dog kept me standing there as only a child can stand, without moving, thinking, the poor dog whimpering with the cold. About 5 o'clock I went on because I heard calling over the hill here and there, and I could see black figures with lights moving and calling out to me and the dog to come home. We came down the sloping field with the neighbours about us, them not saying a word, maybe marvelling at me, thinking I had been dead. And the torches and lamps making everything crazy with light, the old crabapple enlarging to the size of the field, its branches wild like arms. Down at last into the yard we came, the dog skulking on the rope, just the same as the day he had arrived to us. And my father came out from the house in his big clothes, all brown with clothes and hair. It was as if I had never seen him before, never looked at him in his entirety from head to toe. And I knew then that the dog and me were for slaughter. My feet carried me on to where he stood, immortal, you would say, in the door. And he put his right hand on the back of my head and he pulled me to him so that my cheek rested against the buckle of his belt. And he raised his own face to the brightening sky
and praise someone in a crushed voice, God maybe, for my safety, and stroked my hair. And the dog's crime was never spoken of, but that he lived till he died. And I would call that the mercy of fathers, when the love that lies in them deeply, like the glittering face of a well, is betrayed by an emergency, and the child sees at last that he is loved and needed, and not to be lived without, and greatly. Thank you so much.